Thank you. I'm Hollis Glazer. I'm at Borough of Manhattan Community College in the Department of Speech, Communication, and Theater. I'm so pleased that we're having our two speakers this morning. I first met them, it was before I joined New York State AAUP, but it was also after I was president or chair, I guess we call it, of Faculty Senate, Academic Senate at BMCC, Borough of Manhattan Community College. And I had some paper at the National AAUP, and I went both to Joerg's presentation and Michael's, and this was mind-blowing for me because honestly, though I had been faculty senate chair, I realized how little I and the rest of my college understood about what shared governance was in reality, and was just stunned that we were not doing it. And so they both kind of shifted my academic life into really going into what shared governance is and how to institute it, both at my college and CUNY-wide, and of course, statewide nationally. So Joerg Tiede is the director of research at AAUP. He has an encyclopedic mind about the details of shared governance in the Red Book. He left Illinois Wesleyan College. He was a professor of computer science there, and he left them to join AAUP. And he really is an amazing resource. So I'm very glad he's here. And same with Michael DeCesare. Michael is professor of sociology at Merrimack College in Massachusetts, and has been, he's been a regular at national AAUP conferences and giving presentations, of course, about shared governance. So we really do have two national leaders in shared governance today, and I'm just very pleased about it. I'm looking forward to their presentation. So I'm going to let them go. What I would like to do is, as you have questions for them, if you want to put them in the chat, I'll track those questions. Joerg, how much time do you want a Q&A right after yours? I know you have to leave early.
Yeah, I have to catch a flight.
How would you like to do this?
I'm happy to, I'm also happy just to take questions. If they pop up while I'm presenting, if you want to just hop in,
Okay.
that's totally fine.
Okay, all right, great. So I'll go ahead if you're inclined, everybody, to put a question in the chat, and I'll try to moderate that a little bit. Or, Joerg, sounds like it's okay for you to raise your hand too. So either way, we'll keep it loose.
On raising the hand, it's just if you wouldn't mind just tracking it, because I'll have the slides up and it's hard to track multiple things at the same time. So if you wouldn't mind just tracking what questions come in and interrupt me as it works, that's
Sure.
great. It can be hard to try to track what's going on in Zoom and have a presentation in front.
Yeah, if he's sharing screen, it'd be best to put in the chat, because it's hard, you know how it is. It's hard to see everybody outside of the screen. So okay, I'm done. Joerg, take it away. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. Let me actually, though, first fill everybody in the good news that Mike actually is, like myself, has joined the staff of the AAUP. And so Mike is also one of the refugees from higher education to the AAUP staff. It's great to be here. I was thinking this is either my fourth or fifth time with the New York State Conference, going back to a meeting at Teachers College in 2015, I believe, and then in Buffalo, and I've been at your online meetings a couple of times. So it's great to be back. I'm going to share my screen. Sally and I were talking a little bit before about what would be most useful. I think what I'm talking about today, some of it may overlap a little bit with what I talked about the last time I spoke at your meeting. I hope it's still useful, in particular, because I think since that time, we put out a tool that you can use to make an assessment of shared governance at your institution and compare that to national figures. That tool is on the AAUP website. I sent a PDF of it to Sally, together with a copy of this presentation and a copy of the report that this is based on. So Sally can share that with participants whenever that's convenient. Let me tie this in before I get started to the issue of accreditation. So, I mean, one of the things that accrediting bodies actually have standards on is governance, and Mike has done very valuable work in bringing together the language of the various accreditation bodies on governance, and Mike will have more to say about that. And so, you know, one of the things that you can try to do with an accreditation visit is to use this as an opportunity to improve governance. That is certainly something that I'm aware of faculties at other institutions over the years have done, by pointing out ways in which governance practices fall short of accreditation standards. If that is something that you want to do, I mean, Mike can give you information about what some of these standards are, but then the question basically is, how do you want to document that governance practices somehow fall short at your institution? And so what I want to talk about today is an assessment tool that I've developed, that you can use as evidence. You can use it for other activities on campus, not specifically for an accreditation visit, but it's certainly one of the places where you could use evidence of shortfalls in governance practices. And this is what the purpose of this tool is. So AAUP principles on academic freedom and tenure are very different from AAUP principles on shared governance. And so, you know, Mike and I have at various times taught workshops at summer institutes and other places on what shared governance is. And there are red book documents on that. But it's important sort of to note how different they are, the shared governance principles, from principles on academic freedom. So on academic freedom, you have the recommended institutional regulations on academic freedom and tenure, which is a document that sort of lays out AAUP standards on academic freedom and tenure in a form that you can directly put into your faculty handbook. There is no such thing on shared governance because we expect that governance practices will actually vary between institutions much more than academic freedom and tenure practices will, or certainly that we would want them to vary. We have the expectation that those are much more specific, whereas how shared governance principles are implemented will differ quite a bit between institutions, because governance is much more dependent on such issues as size, mission, control, the history of the institution, etc. And so given how much governance practices are known to vary, there has actually been a long-standing interest in using surveys to try to find out to what extent they vary. And so, you know, the AAUP conducted its first governance survey in 1920. There are a variety of surveys that were done in the 30s, the 50s, and then in the 70s, there was one that I'll have an opportunity to talk about here in a moment. These surveys can address two different kinds of things. So on the one hand, you can simply ask how prevalent are certain kinds of practices that we would expect to differ, but you can also use them to figure out, you know, to what extent AAUP principles are actually generally practiced. And again, I guess the goal here is maybe just to back up for a moment and to say, you know, I initially, when I joined the staff, I was in the Department of Academic Freedom, Tenure, and Governance. And I was giving a lot of these presentations, but regularly people would then ask me, after I got through talking about here are AAUP principles, people would then say, but how commonly are they actually practiced? And most of the time I would have to answer that I don't know, because there was so little recent survey research. And so that sort of got me involved in proposing that we conduct more of our work on also finding out practices and finding out statistical information about the core principles that we advocate for. And so that's how I ended up moving into the research department. So the 2021 shared governance survey that I'm going to talk about had sort of 4 main sections. It has information about demographic and professional characteristic of Senate chairs. It has information about impact of COVID pandemic on governance, governance structures, presidential searches, participation of contingent faculty in governance and faculty board communication, and then relative authority of faculty administration in different areas of decision making. And this presentation focuses on the last of these. Just to say that there was an initial report that we put out about the impact of the COVID pandemic on governance. Then last summer was the one on relative authority of faculty administration. And then this past fall is there was a special issue of Academe on governance, and I had a report in there that was the last of the 3 reports on the governance survey, and so you might look at that as well. And so again, I mean, in general, of course, the purpose of collecting statistical information on these issues, on AAUP principles, is for you to be able to use that information. And so just a couple of things, and I'll get back to this at the end of the presentation. I mean, the first observation is sort of kind of obvious, but just to sort of stress that, you know, it's most helpful to use statistical information of this type when what is going on at your institution falls short of common governance practices. You know, if on some issue you are well above what's going on generally, then, you know, pointing to that won't really help you very much to try to improve circumstances. I think that's kind of obvious, but just to, you know, you want to look for cases where this information will be helpful to you to demonstrate that what is actually happening out there is, you know, your institution falls short of that. And some of the time you can look at all institutions, but the survey does give, or the report does give, results also by Carnegie classification, so just by bachelor's, master's, and doctoral institution. It does give it by size, because size, you know, has long been known to be an important determinant of certain governance practices. Collective bargaining status, I have information about that. So there are sort of the next 2 things are sort of 2 methodological observations about how you use those. So as I said, last fall, we had a report on governance structures. So there are things in there like, does the faculty participate in the presidential search? Is there a means for direct communication between the board and the faculty? Can part-time contingent faculty participate in governance? Can full-time contingent faculty participate in governance? On all of those issues, you know, if you want to compare what's going on at your institution to those findings, you really don't have to do any special work, right? All you have to do is say, can part-time faculty vote in Senate elections, yes or no, and then compare it to these findings. But the presentation that I'm showing you here today, when it comes to the question of what's the relative authority of the faculty in the administration, that isn't quite as straightforward, right? I mean, you know, and in principle, it might be even subject to some disagreement between different observers, exactly how the authority is shared on various issues. And so, just to say, for that reason, I designed this instrument that is intended to be used locally to try to determine this, and then you can compare that to the findings that I'm showing you here. And then finally, there are some of these findings that are really more sort of general interest, rather than specifically intended to be used to improve local circumstances. For instance, you know, just questions about the demographic information about Senate chairs, for instance. I had an opportunity, basically, I had an audience of Senate chairs completing or Senate presidents completing the questionnaire. So I asked them also about their race, ethnicity, and gender, and use it as an opportunity to get some information about that as a group of people, how they compare to full-time faculty, etc. But those findings I think are interesting, but they're not really intended to improve your local conditions. So that's sort of a third group of findings that I'm reporting on there. So very briefly then on this issue of relative authority of the faculty and the administration, the statement on government, and this is sort of a small portion of this larger presentation on shared governance that Mike and I have done at various times. The statement on government really has one core point, which is that what shared governance really means is that decision-making involves three groups: the faculty, the board, the administration, and how much weight is given in a particular decision to each of these groups will differ. I mean, that's already a really important observation right there, because there are all kinds of misconceptions that sort of view decision-making as essentially uniform. Everything is just in the end the board's decision. Everything from the faculty, therefore, is merely a recommendation. And so, that is sort of a uniform view of shared governance that is not found in the 1966 statement, the Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, but rather that it depends. So you look at the particular decision, and then as the second quote here says, differences in the weight of each voice from one point to the next should be determined by reference to the responsibility of each component for the particular matter at hand. So, a faculty recommendation, which it might still technically be in, say, a tenure decision, is fundamentally different than something on some other matter of university operation that may not have any direct relation to primary responsibility. And then the statement also observes that the faculty has primary responsibility for such fundamental areas as curriculum, subject matter and methods of instruction, research, faculty status, and those aspects of student life which relate to the educational process. Now, these are areas of primacy, but then there are other areas where the faculty does not have primary responsibility, but still participates in the decision-making. And so the statement identifies long range, or what we now call strategic planning, hiring and evaluation of administrators, physical plant, and budget as areas where the faculty should participate. They don't have primary responsibility in those areas, but they do have opportunity for meaningful participation. And sort of the extent to which weight is given to the faculty's voice in these areas will depend on how specific areas in those areas, so within those areas, relate to areas of primacy. So for instance, if a portion of the strategic plan is about long-term curricula planning, as opposed to long-term planning of the physical plant, those are two very different areas. And so in the former, the faculty should have significant voice. In the latter, the faculty should perhaps have some voice, but then you would, if it comes to things like physical plans and buildings, it would sort of again depend on are these classroom buildings? Faculty should have then more of a voice in that, as opposed to athletic buildings, etc. So this is the hierarchy of levels of faculty participation. So respondents were asked to assess the relative authority in a large number of areas that I'll go through. So this is a 5-point scale. There is sort of a midpoint, an equilibrium, if you will, called joint authority. And joint authority, it means that both groups exercise equal influence in decision making. And clearly, if an area is subject to collective bargaining, that means that both sides have to agree. The level of faculty participation should presumably be joint authority in those areas. But then you have at the two endpoints, you have dominance, which is that the group is making decisions essentially unilaterally, and the other group is informed of the decision, but generally has no influence. And then primacy is that the group has primary authority for the area, but the other group has an opportunity to participate in the final decision meaningfully. But if there's disagreement, the group that has primacy normally prevails. So you have administrative dominance on one end, faculty dominance on the other hand, then administrative primacy and faculty primacy, and then in the middle, joint authority. I'm happy to go back if there are questions to some of the finer points here of the definitions, but I'll just move along for now. These are some finer points here too. The main thing I want to actually point out here is the second point. So if there is system level governance, then we ask respondents to report about the institutional level. This final point is really important, which is, when you're looking at the question of what is the level of faculty participation, respondents really should, we're asked to assess what is the actual practice that is employed on campus, rather than how is this somehow specified in regulations and bylaws. And to be honest, I mean, when it comes to looking at governance regulations or bylaws, and I'm sure Mike can speak to this too, I mean, there are really two extremes that actually happen more often, I think, than we're sort of giving it credit for, which is on the one hand, the extreme of lofty language in regulations about how important the role of the faculty is, which is simply then not borne out in the reality of decision making. But there's also quite regularly the opposite of very draconian language that sort of just says, well, the board has final authority for everything, so all decisions in the end are the board's decision. But in reality, at some institutions with rather draconian language, there may be practices that differ quite a bit from that. And so simply to say that when you assess governance at an institution, and I mean, this is really also relevant for something like an accreditation issue. There are accreditation requirements related to governance, again, that Mike can speak to. But say any institution that would claim to meet those requirements and simply points to its regulations and bylaws and says, look, the regulations say that the faculty have this role in decision making, from my perspective, would just not be sufficient, because there are plenty of instances that we're aware of where regulations say one thing, but then in reality it looks quite different, which is one of the reasons why doing sort of an empirical assessment of this type is important. So I'm moving into the areas, and I do know, and I recall that this was a question that came up the last time I spoke about results of the survey. I do want to stress that. So this was a survey of Senate presidents and chairs. It was a survey at four-year institutions. I have been actually in touch with some people who have an interest in developing this at two-year institutions. And I know there were people in this group who asked me questions about this. And so just to say that I have actually since been in touch with some folks who do research in the two-year area, and have an interest in working with me on developing this in the two-year area as well. But this is work that is hasn't even quite started yet, because I'm currently finishing up a different survey on something else. In any event, so I asked respondents for each of these areas, using the 5-point scale that I showed you a moment ago, to assess at their institution what is the level of faculty participation. And so this is program level curricular decisions. So again, this would be individual courses, major minor requirements, establishing new programs, then institutional curricular decisions, so as opposed to program level ones, grade assignments to individual students, undergraduate admission requirements, teaching assignments of individual faculty members, policies concerning intellectual property, and policies concerning how courses are delivered, including online learning. And so this is the first set of findings here. So this is presented in the form of what is called a diverging stacked bar chart. So as you can see, the dark blue on the right is that it's faculty dominance. The lighter blue, it's faculty primacy. The gray is that it's joint authority. The light, I don't know, peach maybe, is administrative primacy, and the darker is administrative dominance. So these are aligned by putting, since joint authority is sort of this neutral area where both have equal power, I've sort of lined these up by centering it on joint authority, and that gives you a sense of the extent that is above and below these midpoints. And so if you know, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but again, I'm also very happy to take questions about any of these. You know, I mean, grade assignments to some degree, you know, to me was almost more like a reality check than anything else. I mean, I guess I included it because previous governance surveys included grade assignments, and it is sort of just a, you know, I guess what I would say is it's a reality check, as in, if this looked very different, if there were a large number of institutions somehow not reporting faculty primacy, faculty dominance on that, you know, that would have been rather catastrophic from my perspective. I mean, this you know, shows that, you know, respondents were recognizing this, and at their institutions, faculty had overwhelmingly authority in this area. And then just to pick out a couple here, program curriculum, I mean, that's certainly an area where, you know, AAUP standards say faculty should have primary responsibility. And as you can see here, at about 3/4 of institutions, that's actually the case, right? So 39. Yes.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I've got a question. So
yeah,
we're talking here about kind of what the standards are around the country.
Well, what the practices are, what the practices are
right.
around the country. Correct.
Right. So, but we also know that these practices are sliding away from shared governance in some cases. So, for instance, with COVID, I mean, at CUNY and I assume at other places, there was a administration came in and decided modalities of, you know, face-to-face and this kind of thing. So when we're looking to use this, it's important also to know what the standards are, right? I mean, it's like, okay, yes, here's the practices, but these practices are shifting right, if you will, or, you know, according to your chart, shifting left, you know.
Right. So, I mean, a couple of things on it. I mean, first of all, it's important to know what the standards are. That is, what are the actual AAUP policies on this issue, because they're the thing that this is being compared to, and that's one of the things that you comparing your local practices to, are the AAUP standards. Then yes, I mean, this is shifting. I mean, I have historical data, and I'll get to that in a couple of slides, showing actually how over the course of 50 years these things have shifted. And so I have that. Yes, I mean, these are moving. And so that's one of the reasons why it's kind of a bad idea to do this only every several decades, which is how often these, you know, the last two surveys like this were done in 1971 and in 2001. And so we have data from 50 years ago and from 20 years ago, and that's it. And clearly that seems like not sufficient to track historical development of the type that you just described. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree. There's reason to think that these are shifting, and the best way to find this out is in maybe another 4 or 5 years to do another survey like this and compare them to the findings of this year rather than wait another 20 years. So, you know, for program curriculum, I guess my main point is that for about 75% of institutions, that is generally in line with AAUP standards. How that's going to be in 5 years, or how this is today, you know, this was you know, in 2021. You know, a couple other things. I mean, you know, I guess I want to just briefly contrast here program curriculum versus institutional curriculum, because I want to get back to this throughout. I mean, it's noticeable that, you know, on program curriculum, faculty actually, you know, it's 3/4 of institutions reporting that at the program level, faculty have primacy or dominance. But when you move to institutional curriculum, it's closer to 60%. And it is sort of noticeable that throughout the survey, when you compare areas by, is it local? So at the department or program level, there was actually generally a higher level of faculty authority than any of the things that were sort of institution-wide. And that's also a historical trend. So I will point to that in a few other places.
Joerg, before you go on,
yeah.
there's a question in the
Yeah.
chat about categories of intellectual property. Is there any breakdown on categories of
Nope.
intellectual property?
No, this was simply asking, I mean, for intellectual property policies, what was the faculty's authority for formulating those policies, you know?
Okay.
And so for instance, at the 18.4% of institutions that reported administrative dominance, at those institutions, essentially the faculty were given an intellectual property policy and were told this is the intellectual property policy. But then at other institutions, there was somewhat more of a role of the faculty in formulating them. Does that help?
Chris Denny asked this question. Chris, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I do. I mean, basically, my question had to do with an aborted initiative from several years ago by our administration to claim ownership of faculty lectures that were posted online. I think what was originally a concern about patents and trademarks in harder sciences sort of creeped. So I was interested to find out if there had been any sort of drilling down to break out, say, issues that relate to patents from things like lectures, which seem a very, very different category. But thank you, this is very helpful.
Right, I mean, just to briefly say, you know, there are several AAUP policies on this issue of intellectual property. There are red book policies. There are books. There's this book on academy industry relationship that we put out that has things about more details about patent issues. So I would refer you to those in terms of just guidance that we offer in terms of what should go into intellectual property policies. And this was simply asking, you know, to what extent was the faculty involved in formulating whatever intellectual property policy exists? And that could be right on any of those issues.
And Joerg, we've got another question from Leah Akins about accreditation bodies coming in.
Yeah, thank you. Joerg, you had mentioned about the accrediting bodies have standards on you know, what shared governance is supposed to be, but it's been my experience that because the accrediting bodies themselves, you know, the members and the bodies, then campus visiting team are administrators that are very sympathetic to this belief that it's really just the board, and the board is the ultimate decider. So even if in fact the faculty are doing the work, and that was my question, that no, in my college that, you know, faculty are still primarily responsibility for the curriculum, but I think that's only because it continues to fit into their narrative. It's starting to not. You know, there are a number of people here I know about guided pathways, and I'm just waiting to see how that is going to, you know, an attempt to destroy the curriculum at community colleges if the faculty can't fight it off. And so I worry about, you know, like just thinking about the accrediting bodies they don't really have our back. It is the same as what you were saying about if the policies on the campus show that you have shared governance, but then in action, it's not really happening. I feel like that's the same thing happening with accrediting bodies. And I was wondering if there's any work being done in that, or thoughts on that, or AUP maybe connecting with the accrediting bodies. So that was a long question, but
sure. And maybe, I don't know if Mike also has additional comments on this. I mean, to be honest, I think, you know, the main thing, I mean, so I mean, one answer is, you know, there is a body in Washington that is sort of the umbrella group of the regional accreditors, and that's called, you know, that organization is called CHIA. And the AAUP has at various times worked with CHIA on statements related to accreditation, that those statements provide some guidance to the accrediting bodies. But I honestly, I mean, just what I would say to your question or your observation about the prevalence of administrator accrediting teams. To be honest, I think my main comment on that is just to encourage everybody who's here today to seek out opportunity to become a visitor with your regional accreditor. I mean, they actually invite nominations to be on accrediting teams. I mean, I'm actually still listed by the HLC as a visitor because I volunteered now almost, I think, I guess maybe 8 or so years ago. And you know, there's a process and, you know, you have to, I don't know what it is at your accrediting body, but for the HLC, it requires some kind of a nomination and things like that. And, you know, there won't be more faculty on these teams unless more faculty participate in this work. And so I would encourage all of you to do that, because that's the only way that we will get more faculty on these. I'll move on and talk. So this is a large group here of areas about personnel decisions. It involves searches, evaluation, setting standards, promotion decisions, and then for full-time and part-time faculty members. It's a large number, but it involves a large number of decisions for different groups. So it's decisions, and then for full-time non-tenure track, for part-time non-tenure track, and for tenured track faculty members. So again, I mean, I'm happy to pick up any of these in detail. I guess one of the things that I found particularly noteworthy here in this is just, there is sort of, if you look for each group of faculty members, so tenure track, part-time, and full-time non-tenure track, there is, within each, you have the highest level of faculty participation for searches, then evaluations, then standards, and then decisions. So it's you know, and so for instance, tenure track faculty searches, which generally is a very local type decision, you know, is very high here in this list, but it's higher than for tenure track faculty, other types of things. The fact that full-time non-tenure track faculty are so much lower than tenure track faculty and even part-time faculty. The reason for that is that institutions without a tenure system, their faculty are all considered full-time non-tenure track for this. So at institutions without a tenure system, they responded to this question for that group of faculty. And institutions without tenure system actually have, you know, generally lower faculty participation. Governance is not as good at institutions without a tenure system. And so they're kind of dragging down the full-time non-tenure track grouping here. Administrative decisions. So there's allocation of positions, decisions about facilities. So this is buildings, selecting the provost, selecting deans, selecting chairs, decisions about teaching loads, institutional budgetary planning, institutional strategic planning. So, you know, a couple of observations here. One is just buildings and budgets. You know, I mean, this does not surprise too many of you. It's still, you know, pretty abysmal finding. You know, at certainly 2/3 of institutions, roughly, faculty have absolutely no role in budgetary decisions. Again, I'm sure this doesn't surprise many people here. It's still, you know, out of line with AAUP standards. I mean, especially on several of these, you know, the administrative primacy, the lighter red, would for many of these actually still be an acceptable level of faculty participation, say on the budget, because it would mean the faculty can meaningfully participate, say, in budgetary decisions, but it is ultimately primarily an administrative decision. So administrative primacy for budgets and for buildings would in many cases be quite sufficient, but notice that is you know, still not the case at a large number of institutions. Provost select, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm also interested in you know, dean selection. I mean,
Yeah.
especially the academic dean. I mean,
Right.
it's so, this is our person, you know.
Yes.
Provost
No,
is
I
our
mean, that
person.
is, Right.
it's-
I mean, so provost and dean selections are both completely out of line with AAUP standards there. I mean, it is interesting because here you see another instance of the sort of local versus institution-wide, chair selection. It's very local. Faculty have a much higher, higher level of participation in general. Dean selection is somewhat less local. And then provost selections institution-wide, you sort of see it dropping off there. And again, you see this in many places in the survey. Yeah, I mean, I think chair selection, dean selection, provost selection are definitely not good. So there are a variety of comparisons. I'll show you a couple of things. So by institutional type, so I did generally compare institutions with and without collective bargaining. It's really important that in a large number of areas, there was no statistically significant difference between CB and non-CB institutions. And I think this is really important because there are long-standing preconceptions about that having a union is somehow negative on governance, or that institutions that are unionized somehow generally have worse shared governance. And the findings of the survey do not support those kinds of claims. Rather, what this shows is that in a vast number of 22 of the 29 areas, there are no differences in the level of faculty participation between those two types of institutions. Now, I will show you the 7 areas where there are differences, and 6 of those 7 CB institutions have a higher level of faculty participation. And then one, it's not a very large difference, but it was statistically significant, and so I listed them all, and I will go over this here in a moment. As I mentioned earlier, there were surveys by the AAUP done in 71. There was a survey by a graduate student in 2001 that the AAUP supported that used the same scale as the 1971 survey. And so I compared those. There are some challenges to that. They used a scale, and the report discusses this in more detail. They used a scale that was not ideal for this, in my opinion. And so there were some challenges in doing that comparison. This is the collective bargaining. Yes.
I'm sorry, Eric, there's another question out there about, is there any sense of best practices? Caroline, correct me if I didn't get this quite right. Best practices of the union in governance bodies. Is there any?
Yes, I mean, so there's a statement in the Red Book called on the relationship between faculty on the relation of faculty governance to collective bargaining, something like that, that gives our general guidance on how shared governance and collective bargaining should reinforce one another. And I think that's our main document on that. So, I mean, just a few things. I mean, as I mentioned before, so these are the only areas of the 29 that I've been talking about where there were any statistically significant differences. So the first of these, all of which have the first 6 of these, the collective bargaining institutions are better or have a higher level of faculty participation. So chair selection, dean selection, these are things that it's maybe not surprising that they would be written into collective bargaining agreements. Certainly salary policy, I mean, it's a very large difference that you can see. It's also not surprising. I can't really say anything about institutions that do collective bargaining that reported that on salary issues, they have that little to say on that. I don't know what's going on at those institutions, but nevertheless, overall, is a significant difference. Teaching loads, again, these are sort of conditions of employment type things, course delivery. And back to the question from St. John's about intellectual property policies. Again, that's actually an area where collective bargaining respondents noted a higher level of faculty participation in formulating intellectual property policies. The only area where you see there is a difference was grade assignment, and I really don't know why that is. I mean, I have to assume that perhaps some collective bargaining agreements specify methods of resolving grading disputes, and that some respondents therefore noted that as different from faculty dominance, but I'm simply reporting it here because these are in fact all 7 areas where there were any statistically significant differences. But I think the ones where there's more faculty participation by unionized institutions, I think there's good reason for that. These are the kinds of things we have historically seen having this kind of pattern. And so, but again, the other really important observation is that there are very few areas where there are significant differences. So these are the historical comparison. I don't want to go too deeply into my different scales here, simply to note that the scale in 71 and 2001 overlapped in some points with the current scale, but not in others, and I aligned them in the way that shows that. I mean, the thing that you notice, for instance, on something like establishing programs is that from 71 to 2001, there was a large increase in faculty authority, which has since fallen back. So we're going back compared to this. Institutional curriculum, we're falling a little bit back, but on program curriculum, it actually shows an improvement over the 2001 findings, assuming that you treat here primacy and dominance together. I guess the main thing to say on this is that this is really one of these places where the institution-wide versus local shows up. So establishing programs, institutional curriculum are somewhat more institution-wide decisions. The program curriculum is more of a local decision. So you see this bifurcation, and this shows up in other places as well. So for personnel decisions, sort of similarly, I mean, salary policies, there was a small improvement from 71 to 2001, but basically we're back to where we were in 71 on salary policies. But then service and tenure decisions, again, which are more local, I mean, certainly tenure decisions at larger institutions are departmental decisions, probably not at small institutions. Searches are probably departmental decisions, even at smaller institutions. Notice that there is an improvement in those areas. And so those are really, again, local more. And I'm sorry, this is kind of small. I hope this shows up okay on your side, but you see the same thing here. So for instance, budget, there was a small improvement from 71 to 2001, but things are as bad, if not worse, than they were in 71 now when it comes to budget. But then again, chair selection, local decision, as an actual improvement. Dean selection, less local than the chair selection, has actually gotten worse. Allocation of positions, which is sort of like budgets, again, has actually gotten worse. Buildings, there was a time in 71 where at least still 10% of respondents felt that they were equally involved in decisions about buildings, but that's gone. Teaching loads, again, there's a smaller drop off there. So these are the historical areas. These are the only ones where there was consistent questions being asked through that whole period. So, the scale and the questions themselves changed over the various surveys. And so these are the only ones where it's in fact consistently available. So I'm moving then to the actual governance survey that you can use on your own campus. Again, I sent that to Sally together with a copy of this presentation. So just a couple of things about how to use that. And so the AAUP actually issued a governance questionnaire for local use in '94. And this is the instruction that Katie Ramo gave back in '94. And I'm quoting it here because, my view is that that's still a good suggestion for how to use these kinds of tools on your local campus. So she wrote, using the instrument as a satisfaction survey will render the results meaningless. The questions are intended to reflect observable conditions at colleges and universities. It is not designed to measure the faculty's opinion of or satisfaction with those conditions. For that reason, the ratings should come from those faculty members who have had fairly intensive experience in governance. This usually means faculty leadership, Senate experience, regular formal contacts with academic officers and the governing board. I recommend that a small group of faculty members with such experience fill out the questionnaire by consensus to improve reliability. And so, again, there's a tool that I sent to Sally, and it's on the AAUP website as well. I would not recommend using this and just do it as an actual survey and administer it to everybody on campus. Because if you basically just take a mean of what everybody has to say, and some of those people have, may just be first-year faculty members who know very little. Others may be, long-serving faculty members who have actually served on the Senate and in other places. And you simply treat each as sort of contributing equally to an average of what everybody has to say. I don't think that will somehow get you closer to the truth, as it will. I think it matters to actually ask people who know a lot about what the actual practices are. And so that's part of the reason why I administered this to Senate presidents, Senate chairs, etc. So again, these are just some guidance here. The questionnaire is best completed by a group of, say, 4 to 6 faculty members with significant experience in governance. Ideally, they should agree for each area of decision making. So ideally, they should look at this and say, yes, we all agree. The level of faculty participation for, departmental curriculum decision is, faculty primacy at this institution. If there are disagreements, it would probably be helpful for the group to talk to each other to figure out why they disagree, what are their different experiences, and to try to come with up with a consensus view of this. They may not be able to, and at some point you might just end up averaging over what people have to say. But I still think it's actually worthwhile to try to do this in this form. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the national findings have been analyzed by Carnegie classification, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral, and whether or not faculty are represented by union and also by size. That may be a more appropriate comparison for your particular areas. And again, you can best use these to improve local conditions when you find that what happens at your institution falls short of common practices. And then the last, and I know that David is here, and David can also speak more to some of the sort of organizing aspects of this. But once you identify areas where the AAUP, where practices, local practices, fall short of AAUP supported standards, it then becomes sort of a political question of which areas do you want to try to improve on your campus. I mean, you may find that there are a large number of areas. And then it becomes questions of where do you want to push? And AAUP chapters, governance bodies, obviously should talk to their members, should try to seek priorities locally to find out what to try to push for. And then, I think there are varieties of ways that you need to work locally to move this forward. So you can have presentations like the ones we're doing here at your conference meeting to educate your colleagues, to educate the administration and board about what AAUP supported standards are for faculty participation in those areas, to what survey findings are in these areas. And then, as a next step, you might want to identify a smaller group that could be, the peer and aspirant group that your institutional research office has already identified. It could be a peer and aspirant group that somehow is used generally on campus, or one that you identify of institutions that are similar to yours, and to try to look at their policies, procedures, to talk to them again about how does this actually work on your campus, and use those findings to come up with proposed solutions for how to improve local conditions. And again, that using that in the context of an accreditation visit might be to write a report about areas where the level of faculty participation on your campus is below that found in the survey, below that recommended in AAUP standards, and put that into a report and try to see if you can submit it to whoever collects information for the accreditation, etc. And then more generally, it is important to organize and work collectively to move these issues forward. I believe that ends my presentation. I will be glad to take any remaining questions that there might be.
Thank you. So if you could stop sharing.
I
maybe
will.
people- Sure. And then people can raise their hands. We've got two screens. Yeah, we've got, so those of you who have questions or comments, the chat was pretty lively throughout. I don't know if you got that, Joerg. Okay, Chris Denny in the chat. Do you have information on the number of CBUs that administrators have dissolved?
I'm not sure that I know what you mean by that. Oh, do you just mean, yeah, Chris, would you mind just, go ahead.
Sure. So in the chat, and this has been something we've dealt with in episodic conversations, we sometimes get fear from faculty that if we're too vocal, we will get, to use the 1980s Supreme Court decision as a verb, yeshivad,
Right.
meaning that the administration will start to move to decertify us. I mean, to gauge the seriousness of that threat, does AAUP have a sort of list of institutions that have had collective bargaining units, decertified in this way? Or is
No,
this
I mean, so Bill Herbert at the Hunter Center, collects information about the prevalence of collective bargaining in the United States, of faculty collective bargaining, and he does regularly include in his reports information about dissolved collective bargaining units. But to be honest, so I'm aware of Bill collecting that information generally. I'm not really aware of an instance where, so the thing about the yeshivaing, to continue with the, so let me preface what I'm going to say by saying, first of all, I mean, these are issues that in the end are a matter of state law, and I am not an attorney, and this will differ a lot from state to state. I mean, because the yeshivaing was under federal law, right? I mean, the yeshivaing is saying that under the National Labor Relations Act, which is a specific enabling legislation for unionization, faculty are managers. But that only applies to private colleges and universities. At public colleges and universities, collective bargaining is regulated by enabling legislation that is state legislation. And so to be yeshiva out of a collective bargaining unit, and again, I'm not the best expert for this, but to be yeshiva at the state level, there would have to be the enabling legislation in your state would somehow have to prohibit collective bargaining in a similar kind of setting.
Close the door, close the door, close the door.
And so simply to say, I'm not aware of instances where that has happened at the state level. I mean, I'm aware that this general issue came up because in the Pacific Lutheran decision, but again, now we're talking again about federal law. In the Pacific Lutheran decision, the National Labor Relations Board basically used governance as a test for non-tenure track faculty wanting to unionize at private institutions, whether they were in fact managerial or not. But so I guess, honestly, Chris, I think I would say, I mean, I guess you should ask if this is a specific concern in the state of New York, you may want to just get advice from, an attorney in New York about the enabling legislation there. I'm sure, you can get assistance from other places, but I mean, it would have to actually be somehow something that is specified in in state law for that to happen at your state, unless I'm somehow sadly mistaken and somebody can correct me, since again, this is not my primary area of expertise.
Thank you.
I still talked a lot anyway.
Thank you. I'm gonna call on Erwin.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. It seems to me the bottom line of your presentation is that we may have a catch-22 situation in which we have governance deficiencies based on AAUP standards, but we don't have a way of rectifying those deficiencies. Because if you have a governance deficiency on your campus, there's no structure available. You mentioned accreditation. I think that's a very weak reed to depend on for the reasons that have been discussed, the dominance of that whole process by administrators who are not friendly to increasing faculty participation. So it falls back to the institution and what means exist on a campus that is deficient to solve the problem. I don't see any, because the very structure that exists at that institution works against faculty participation. So how is the faculty able to change that structure?
Right. I mean, and I guess one answer, Irving, as you know, of course, is through unionization. I mean, historically in the United States, unionization has been particularly active when faculty governance was weak at those institutions. I mean, you know, St. John's, of course, is a famous historical case where in the 60s, faculty sought to unionize because they were not given adequate governance rights. So I guess I would say, you know, obviously, given what happened with yeshiva, that doesn't help at private universities because of the of what circumstances are. And then, you know, I guess David and others can chime in and talk about how, you know, in the absence of collective bargaining, you can nevertheless organize as a faculty to act to advance your AAUP standards. I guess that's why there are AAUP chapters. That's why there is a New York State conference to help faculty organize to advance these kinds of standards. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're saying, Irving. I think is just historically true that at institutions where there is very little faculty authority and decision making, there also is very little recourse to try to address that. That's always been true. And that's why, especially, you know, in the 60s and 70s at those institutions, there was such a large expansion of collective bargaining.
Thank you, Joerg.
Thank you. If nobody else, does anybody else have something?
I believe Mary Rose has her hand up.
Right. I wanted Mary Rose, just give me 1 second. There was a question in the chat from Ann Friedman, and then Mary Rose, I'll call on you. So Ann wanted to know why the survey did not include community colleges. They're significant.
There are simply some issues in terms of sampling community colleges. It's technically a difficult issue to address, and so I focused on one group to start out, and I'm hoping to have a follow-up study on community colleges.
Thank you. Mary Rose, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Joerg said about, I mean, because I think Erwin, that is the crux of the matter, right? We're here today because we want shared governance to work better on all of our campuses. And I think this information is really helpful, but what do we do with this information? And we have to organize, right? I mean, and and it helps to have a CV chapter, right? But that's not possible for some of us. We know, which I just tried that and got yeshivaed by the NLRB, even though they're not even religiously affiliated. So there's that, but they now have an advocacy chapter, the AAUP. And I mean, I think where shared governance is working is where, shared governance is a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and faculty is overworked. And so I think a lot of the problem with shared governance is that we're dropping the ball, and it's kind of not our fault because there's a lot being put on us. But I think places where faculty are stepping up and sort of using what structures they have and using those to make them better, I think is where where faculty are, like Canisius. I don't know if anybody from Canisius is here. Tanya was with us yesterday. I mean, they just took over their faculty senate. Their AAUP folks, they ran AAUP candidates and took over the faculty senate, and now shared governance is working better there, right? So, I mean, there are limits, and sometimes they're really, really, really awful administrations and boards, and there's only so much that can be done. But I think organizing is the only real answer.
I see there's,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just saw there's a question in the chat, and then I see that Kimberly has her hand up.
Perfect.
I mean, the question in the chat is what tools administrations might use to assess governance. I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I think, sometimes administrations bring in quote unquote governance consultants. I'm not sure what kinds of tools they use for these kinds of things. I mean, I have had administrators reach out asking to use the document that we developed, the tool, and that's on our website. Anybody can use it. But I'm not. I mean, other than that, there are sort of people who provide services as governance consultants. I'm not sure what other tools they use. Kimberly.
Yeah, we really, really appreciate all the information that you've shared with us today and your perspective and your hard work for the faculty. I recall last year that we had discussed that the community college sector wasn't involved in this project. Could you clarify what the difficulty is in administering it to community colleges? And I was thinking, having been involved with the community college committee, and now Hollis is chairing that, if maybe the community college committee or community college faculty on campuses could assist you. Is there something that you need from us? Because I just think this is a sector where this information would be incredibly important and be helpful.
I think there are two things. So I mean, let me say that when I issued the report last year, I don't know if you're familiar with her, Susan Cater, who is she's a researcher who has published several things on governance at two-year institutions. She reached out and offered assistance in preparing this. And so I had a chance to talk to her about it, but I was already in the middle. I'm currently finishing up a survey on tenure practices.
Wow.
And so whenever I'm done with that, we are going to look at doing this. I think there are two issues, and certainly when that happens, I will reach out to the community college committee for additional input. I mean, the one thing is actually thinking through the extent to which there are aspects of governance at community colleges that may be sufficiently different to warrant changes to the survey instrument. I think, and to the extent that that's true, then it was actually good. I didn't just send the same thing out everywhere. So I mean, it was also just a matter of, I know more about governance at four-year institutions. I felt quite confident I could prepare the survey instrument and send it out and get results. It will take additional time to talk to people at community colleges and ask, does this all make still sense? Or are there aspects to governance that are sufficiently different? I mean, I do think that that's an important issue. The other issue is, I mean, this is so the other thing is I could certainly, once I have drawn a random sample of institutions, I could use assistance to help encourage respondents to actually complete the survey. I will say that in general, we have lower response rates from community colleges on a lot of things that we do than we do at four-year institutions. I think that's due to several issues. I think one of them is they look at the word American Association of University Professors, and they think that has nothing to do with them because it says university professors. And that has caused us, for instance, we have lower participation from community colleges in our compensation survey. And my colleague, Glenn Colby, who actually worked at a community college in institutional research, has done already work to reach out to those institutions. And several times the response was, oh, this said university professors, we assumed you sent us this by accident because this has nothing to do with us. And so we're gonna have to do some work to talk to people and say, yes, we want your response. And so to the extent that once we've drawn this survey sample, to reach out to those institutions then, and if it's somebody you happen to know, to encourage them to complete the instrument, that would be great. I mean, I will say separately, I mean, this is a technical issue and I don't want to take up too much time with this, but just to say, iPads collects certain types of information, and I use iPads then to divide up the population of all institutions into little segments. One of the things they don't collect is information about unionization. Especially for community colleges, it would be important to make sure that I draw samples based on unionization. That requires processing the data that Bill Herberts collects at Hunter on unionization. And that is something that we're currently doing, but that's actually kind of a lengthy thing for us to do because it's in one format and we need it to be in a different format. I'm explaining it at length because you all asked me this question last time, and I do want to make sure you understand that we are responsive to that concern, but it's just not something that can just be solved overnight. There are just a lot of technical issues, but once we start working on this, I certainly will reach out to the Community College Committee to get their thoughts on whether the governance survey instrument ought to be different. And once I have a sample of institutions, any assistance we can get to encourage respondents to complete the survey, that would be incredibly useful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your thorough explanation. I think the Community College Committee, I don't want to speak for Hollis, but I think that would be a really good starting point. And then there are governance, statewide governance organizations in many states. For example, in New York State, it's the Faculty Council of Community Colleges. So those might be, Hollis, those might be organizations that you could tap into with PSC, the Community College Caucus, those types of things. But thank you, Joerg, and we'll do whatever we can to assist you with that for sure.
Thanks. I mean, just to say, when you actually move to system level governance, I mean, they actually then become somewhat more different things. I mean, I think it is valuable also separately to think about surveys about system level governance. I mean, there are 4-year systems, there are 2-year systems, there are mixed 2-year, 4-year systems. And if they have governance at the system level, that isn't captured here either. I just asked at the institutional level. I mean, I think the thing is that for a lot of the stuff, there's just a lot more work that needs to be done. I mean, to some degree, what I'm pointing to here is why I felt there was a need for us to spend more of our time and resources on developing this, because this actually takes a lot of work. And so in any event, I appreciate the question, and I took a little more time to answer it than maybe it was necessary, but I did want to be sure that you know that I am thinking about this and that we are responsive to these concerns, but it is taking a while to really get this all done. Leah has her hand.
Thank you. Since the Board of Trustees is such an important part of the piece of shared governance and the Middle States standards really about shared governance is really about the board. It's really not about what we think of as shared governance. I was wondering if you've considered collecting data on Board of Trustees policies and practices across the country in terms of hearing from the campus shared governance, and also board policies or actions on how they take in public comment, what kind of opportunities there are and how they limit public comment. We're having that particular issue right now with our board. And if boards knew what like the national standards were, it could be a little, it could give us something to really hit them over the head with a club maybe, but to point out that they're out of line. This is not the standard of how boards operate. Or if they are in line, then we need to collectively act nationally. Then it's a national problem in terms of board policies and taking in public comments. So I was wondering if you've looked at that at all yet, and if not, if you'd consider it.
No, I mean, so I haven't. I think so I mean, on this issue of boards, I mean, I mentioned earlier CHIA. I have not had a chance to read it because I think it came out just this week or the week before. But CHIA actually just issued, together with the Association of Governing Boards, a statement on the role of governing boards in accreditation. And so, given your question, you might want to look at this. It's a joint statement by CHIA and AGB and there is also a document that Mary Rose just pointed to on the governance standards from the AGB. I mean, on the issue of public comment, I mean, the AGB does actually collect some information on board practices, and so I would suggest looking at maybe if there are some things from the AGB related to this. They do have a report. I think collecting data specifically about boards is something that the AGB has been more involved in, and but I mean, it's certainly something that we might think about. But I think my first suggestion would be to look at something what the AGB might have done on that issue. And I don't know.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you just spell out what CHIA stands for?
It's and I think Mike just posted a link to it. It's the I think it's the Council of Higher Education Accreditors.
Okay.
So, and I don't know, I have maybe 2 minutes left. Did we say that I had till
10:15? We've got one more.
Okay, so maybe Julie, I'll take that as the last question.
Perfect.
Yeah, hi, this is maybe more of a suggestion than anything else. Fairly recently, our University Faculty Senate CUNY had run a coach survey. And I know we did one a handful of years back. And I know these coach surveys are faculty satisfaction surveys to some extent, but like our UFS survey crossed 4-year colleges, 2-year colleges, and there was a section on shared governance or governance in general, different levels, dean, chair, faculty, all the way through. And these coach surveys are, I forget who exactly administers them, but they're administered at a number of different campuses. It's not unique to CUNY. I'm just wondering if there's a way of maybe mining data from those kinds of surveys, at least in the interim, for the 2-year colleges versus the 4-year colleges, and maybe trying to get some sort of information that maybe even sort of stratifying, differences between community colleges and senior colleges. As I said, it's not a perfect vehicle for doing this, but maybe it would be a way of making some inroad here.
So, right. So it is something that is done at Harvard. So Harvard is the place that
yeah, you're right, it's Harvard.
Right. And I've looked at this in the past. To the best of my knowledge, actually, I mean, it's just they're basically running a consulting operation. So they sell this to institutions, and they do not make the data then available in general. So I can't actually. I mean, they're just using this. I mean, as I say, I think sort of satisfaction surveys, I mean, I suppose can be kind of interesting, just to get a general sense how people feel about things. It's not.
Sometimes there's information. I know I look carefully at our results, and there was some information that could be gleaned, I suspect,
Right.
from it, although maybe not as deep as we'd like for it to be, but it might be at least a way of getting at least
Right.
a little something of value there.
Right. To the best of my knowledge, they don't make that available to outsiders.
But can institutions, individual institutions, make it available to the AAUP? Could they volunteer, like if you reached out to the institutions, to the, like the, faculty senates, et cetera, and ask, could you make them available to us to, do an analysis on?
would that be, I don't know if that would be possible or not. I don't know if there's a copyright protection of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either. I mean, yeah, my guess is that given, given how they operate this particular consulting thing, that they probably put restrictions on this, and there may be, I mean, there are some sort of data request opportunities there. I'm I haven't looked at it. I guess I'm somewhat skeptical. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's there are
There are going to be
They're-
limitations on it. Yeah,
Right,
but
I
I was
mean,
just
it's-
thinking
it's-
as a
right.
beginning
So-
point, it might be
Yeah,
better than
that's-
nothing.
Thank you. Thank you for that
Thanks.
question. So
Sure.
Yeah. So Joerg, thank you so much. This was very informative. It's giving us a lot to think about and talk about. The chat was pretty lively. So, but we're switching now to Michael's presentation. And Joerg, are you leaving us soon? Is that what's happening? When?
I am
Okay.
going to stick around just a little moment, and then I do have to catch a flight.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So if it's okay with you, Michael, can I run this kind of the same way, interrupt you if there's questions in the chat that are relevant at that moment?
Oh, absolutely. That'd be totally
Okay.
fine, Alice.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I'll just go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to thank Sally for the invitation to be here today, and thank Hollis for that very generous introduction earlier of both of us. There will be some overlap with Joerg's presentation, but really not much at all. Sally had asked me to talk about AAUP principles of academic governance. And then after that, the standards that the regional accrediting bodies use in terms of faculty governance and how those align, or much more frequently do not align, with AAUP recommended standards. And then I'll close out by talking about some possible avenues for faculty action, both in terms of governance on campus and in terms of accreditation, which will pick up some of the thread that started with Joerg's presentation. So those are the three main topics that I'll go through. From the very beginning of the founders of the AAUP in the founding document of the association declared the importance of the faculty's role in institutional governance, and said that the trustees hold an essential and highly honorable place in the conduct of universities, but the faculties hold an independent place with quite equal responsibilities to those of the trustees. And further, when it comes to scientific and educational questions, the founders of the AAUP said, the faculty has the primary responsibility. And so since its founding, like I said, 107 years ago, the association has emphasized the importance of the faculty's role in institutional decision-making. The culmination of the first several decades of work in that area was, of course, the foundational statement on government of colleges and universities, which is the authoritative formulation of governance principles. The AAUP jointly formulated that document, and this is an important historical piece to this. It was a joint formulation by the AAUP with both the American Council on Education, which represents presidents, and the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, which of course represents trustees. And each of those two groups commended that statement to its members. So, 50 some odd years ago, these three groups saw fit to come together and arrive at shared principles of academic governance. And so when a president or a provost or a trustee says to a faculty member, well, that statement doesn't mean anything anymore because it's too old, it's always helpful, well, it can be helpful to remind that person that both the ACE and the AGB were involved in formulating that statement. And in fact, that the AGB, as recently as I believe 2017 or 2018, reaffirmed that quote unquote specific reference to the statement on government in the institution's governing documents is an important foundation for the institution's commitment to academic governance. So this statement, I would argue, is maybe more important now than ever before, despite the claims by some administrators and trustees that it's akin to a black and white TV or some such thing. So the statement opens generally with principles of academic governance, and it calls more specifically for adequate communication, shared responsibility, and joint planning and effort among the board, faculty, and administration. And it goes on to identify specific areas of primary responsibility for those three components. And the reason it calls for these particular aspects, and the reason why it outlines areas of primary responsibility for each of the three institutional components, is for the reason on this slide, that the variety and complexity of the tasks that are performed by our colleges and universities, again, made much more now than in the 60s, produce an inescapable interdependence among the various components on campus. It recommends joint governance. The statement, interestingly enough, never actually uses the term shared governance. That phrase came about at some point after this statement was formulated. I'm still not quite sure where it came from, but it never mentions shared governance. It talks about joint effort and academic governance. Shared only came later. And whatever we call it, the statement recommends it because any institution in which all the components are aware of their interdependence and of the usefulness of communication among themselves and of the force of joint action rather than unilateral action will enjoy increased capacity to solve educational problems. That means two things generally. First, appropriate joint planning and effort calls for all components to participate in institutional decision-making. And that's what the quote on this slide says. All components get to participate in decision-making. There's a second part to that, though, and that's that it requires participation depending on the degree of responsibility. So while board, administration, faculty all get to participate in the significant decision-making, differences in the weight of each of their voices should be determined by reference to the responsibility of each component for the particular matter at hand. And so the statement goes on to delineate exactly what those areas are that the governing board, administration, and faculty have respective primary responsibility for. The governing board ensures that the institution stays true to its mission. Obviously, it plays a major role in ensuring that the institution has the financial resources necessary to operate. And something that faculty members don't often like hearing, the board does possess final decision-making authority. The board has fiduciary responsibility for the institution, and it does possess final decision-making authority. That said, however, the statement explicitly says, quote, the board should undertake appropriate self-limitation. What that means in practice is that while it maintains a general overview, the board delegates its authority. It entrusts the conduct of the administration to the president and other administrative officers, and it entrusts the conduct of teaching and research to the faculty, because it's the faculty that has expertise, collective expertise in teaching and research. So again, just to reiterate, while the board has final decision-making authority, it's supposed to engage in self-limitation through the delegation of that authority to the administration and the faculty. The president's work is to plan, to organize, to direct, and to represent, as the statement summarizes that section. The president is obviously the chief executive officer of the institution, and as such provides institutional leadership. And as such, is responsible for ensuring effective communication between all the components of the institution, perhaps especially between the governing board and the faculty. And the president is also responsible for ensuring that how the institution operates conforms not only to the policies that are set forth in the faculty handbook or the CBA, but also conforms to sound academic practice. And finally, the president is responsible for maintaining institutional resources, creating new resources, fundraising, of course. The president has managerial responsibility for the non-academic activities that institutions are involved in, whether it's athletics or student life or what have you. To go back to the president, what was on the previous slide about the president's responsibilities, the statement makes clear that the president should be equally qualified to serve both as the executive officer of the governing board, but also as the chief academic officer of the institution and the faculty. And this would apply to system presidents as well, the same principle. And that was part of the reason why there was such a hullabaloo about the appointment of Sonny Perdue recently to head a university system, someone who has little to no experience in academia. And in that same dual role, that same dual role is reflected in the board, in the statement on government's admonition that the president should have the confidence of both the board and the faculty. The role of the faculty as the third institutional component. The faculty has responsibility, in other words, voice and decision-making authority, for matters in proportion to the degree of their expert knowledge. Again, each of these components has primary responsibility for areas where they have expertise. And for the faculty, that primary responsibility is for such fundamental areas as curriculum, subject matter and methods of instruction, research, faculty status, and those aspects of student life which relate to the educational process. Those areas belong to the faculty. Faculty status in particular, again, an area of the faculty's primary responsibility, includes appointments, reappointments, decisions not to reappoint faculty members, promotions, the granting of tenure, dismissal. These are all areas in which the faculty should have primary responsibility under the principles outlined in the statement on government, which again were jointly formulated with the organization that represents presidents and the organization that represents trustees. What primary responsibility means is also articulated very clearly in the statement, that on these matters, the matters that were on the previous slide, the power of review or final decision lodged in the governing board or delegated by the board to the president should be exercised adversely only in exceptional circumstances and for reasons communicated to the faculty. It is not consistent with AAUP recommended principles of governance for a provost or a dean or a president to simply deny faculty members' tenure petition or promotion petition unilaterally. That is not how it's supposed to happen. That authority should be exercised adversely only in exceptional circumstances and for reasons communicated to the faculty. And then after that, according to the statement, it's desirable that the faculty should have opportunity for further consideration and further transmittal of its views to the president or board. It should not be the dean, provost, president, whoever has made the decision and that's it, the door is closed, that's the end of the story. That is not, that does not comport with association recommended standards for governance. Again, in areas of faculty primacy, boards and presidents should, according to the statement, quote, concur with faculty judgment, except in rare instances and for compelling reasons which should be stated in detail. The faculty also has primary responsibility for admissions, oversight over admissions. The faculty should set requirements for degrees and determine when those requirements have been met. We as faculty are so used to having admissions offices and registrars' offices that many of us have come to think, well, that's just the responsibility of those offices. It is not under the standards articulated in the Statement on Government. Those are the faculty's responsibilities. The registrar's office and the admissions office can help us carry out those responsibilities as faculty members and to facilitate our exercise of those responsibilities, but they should not take them over. Again, it's the faculty that has collective expertise in things like admission standards and degree requirements, not the staff in the registrar's office or the admissions office. Joerg alluded to this in his presentation as well, that even in areas where the faculty isn't afforded primary responsibility under the Statement on Government, the faculty still gets to participate in decision-making. Again, all the components get to participate in significant decisions on campus. It's just that the strength of their voice depends upon the matter at hand. So even though the faculty doesn't have primary responsibility for long-range or strategic planning, the faculty should still be meaningfully involved in that planning. The same goes for decisions regarding physical plan and facilities on campus. After all, who knows better than the faculty what will be necessary for a new building, a new academic building with classrooms or faculty office space? Who knows better than the faculty what will be needed in terms of renovating existing classrooms or existing faculty offices? The same principle applies to budgetary matters and decisions about salaries more specifically. And we have statements in the Red Book specifically on budget and salary and the role that the faculty should play in that process. And then finally, the hiring and evaluation of administrators, especially academic administrators. The faculty should play a meaningful role in that process as well. Somebody mentioned earlier, either in the chat or out loud, searches for deans, searches for provosts, and Joerg showed some of his data on these. Deans, academic deans, provosts, these, I think Hollis said, these are our people, right, as faculty. And so, of course, the faculty should have a strong voice in the process of their appointment. The vice president for, financial whatever, maybe not so much. But the provost and vice president for academic affairs, yes, very much. And then in terms of communication, the statement is clear that structures for communication among the three components should exist and, quote, be clearly understood and observed. When it comes to the relationship between the faculty and the board specifically, we have a derivative statement called Faculty Communication with Governing Boards, Best Practices, which I had occasion to put a link in the chat box earlier when this came up during the discussion during Joerg's presentation. And that statement has three really good recommendations for communication between faculty and board. One of which is that every standing committee of the board, including its executive committee, should have faculty representatives on it. Another of which is that there should be regular meetings between either a conference committee or a liaison committee of just board members and just faculty members, no president involved. So what the essence of the traditional conception of academic governance is, in part, is that all voices are not equal in institutional governance. The Statement on Government never says that shared governance is the same as democracy. It is not. The voices of the faculty, president, and board should not be equal in everything. Instead, the faculty exercises primary responsibility in areas of its expert knowledge, subject matter and methods of instruction, curriculum, research, the matters on a previous slide. And then, as I said, the administration and board should normally concur with faculty recommendations in those areas where the faculty has primary responsibility. In other words, In academic matters, a faculty decision should normally be a final decision. In even other words, the administration and board should maintain a hands-off policy with regard to academic matters. For all practical purposes, the faculty should be allowed to call the shots in academic decision-making. Typically, that is not what administrators and trustees refer to when they talk about shared governance. They're talking about something very different. But when we're talking about the AAUP's standards and the statement on government, that is exactly what we're talking about. Hollis, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is so important right now, and Kimberly also, the community college committee right now is kind of taking on, or just I mean, we're just trying to get a grip on what's happening with workforce development in community colleges, because it is coming down from the boards and the presidents that we have to switch into workforce development. And I mean, this is in various ways, right? And I mean, it's coming down in different ways, but many of us are getting the clear directive that, our curriculum has to lead to jobs within 2 years. And it's, I don't have anything else to say about that other than that. I mean, it's really severe right now.
Yeah, and we're seeing it, I think, across the entire sector, this emphasis on, career training and job training, and more institutions have, career development services, career development officers. I know at Merrimack College, we now have career coaches. Each student has a career coach in addition to an academic advisor. And there's a real danger, and it's also become the reality at many places, of that seeping into the curriculum. And I have to say, I think Mary Rose said earlier about the faculty sometimes dropping the ball when it comes to governance. This is one of those areas where I think that that assertion is particularly accurate. The curriculum belongs to the faculty, right? Under the principles outlined in the statement on government. We're supposed to control that. But too often what we've seen is a faculty collectively kind of bending to this notion that, well, what college is really about, especially since it's so expensive, whether it's 2 years or 4 years or whatever, what college should really be about is preparing these students to get themselves out of debt as quickly as possible. And that's going to require that they have jobs as early as possible upon graduation. And therefore, it's incumbent on the faculty through the curriculum to prepare them for all of that. That, of course, represents just a fundamental shift in the public's perception of the purpose of higher education. And we've seen students internalize that, we've seen their parents internalize that, and that makes it much more difficult for us to do our work as faculty. When students sit in our classes and say, well, how is this going to help me get a job? I'm not quite sure how to answer that in an introductory to sociology course or in a philosophy course or whatever, right? And that's something that I think, Hollis, you put your finger on it. It's something that faculty across the sector, I think, are grappling with, and it's not going away anytime soon. The important point from the AAUP's perspective is that the curriculum be in the hands primarily of the faculty. The administration, of course, can make a suggestion, can bring a proposal, but at the end of that process, it should be the faculty's call in terms of what gets taught, how it gets taught. Somebody mentioned modality earlier, that, whether it's in person or online, and all of that should be the faculty's.
Right. And it's not going away. And we're also expanding into micro credentials because the high school population is getting smaller. So we're now, we, along with, I think, everybody else, is looking at adult, people who are already in the work sector and maybe even have their bachelor's already. I mean, it's getting very heavy right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and small institutions like mine are developing master's programs and possibly even doctoral programs in response to that same trend. We're told that we can't rely on the traditional revenue stream of undergraduates, so we need to start to appeal to graduate students and students of non-traditional age for additional quote unquote revenue streams. Okay, as long as the faculty maintain control of the curriculum and subject matter and methods of instruction and all the other things on this slide and on previous slides. And so from the AAUP's perspective, those are the principles that should govern the academic decision-making on any campus. Now, we also have these 7 regional accrediting agencies, each of which has its own governance standards to a greater or lesser extent. And accreditation, according to CHIA, which is the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, is a collegial process of self-review and peer review for improvement of academic quality and public accountability of institutions and programs. And as we all know, accreditation typically involves 3 primary activities: a self-study, either at the institutional or programmatic level, a review of the institution or program that's conducted by an outside visiting committee, and I'll say more about visiting committees later on, and then a decision by these accrediting agencies to either accredit or accredit with conditions or not to reaccredit the institution or program. And the AAUP has long been interested in accreditation and has long encouraged faculty to be more involved in the accreditation process. In 1968, the association issued its first statement, the role of the faculty in the accrediting of colleges and universities, which presented recommended standards, both for institutions and specifically for faculty members, and also for regional accrediting commissions. And when I send this presentation to Sally, which I didn't do prior to this, and I apologize, I will include that statement as well. And actually, I include a link to that statement at the end on the last slide, and also to an article that was in the March-April 2008 issue of Academe magazine. It's a compilation of 3 reports on accreditation, 2 of which I'll talk about a little bit later on, and all of which you'll have access to either through this presentation or through separate documents that I'll send to Sally and that she can pass on to everybody. So the latest AAUP involvement formally in terms of a statement was a joint advisory statement, just a brief one in 2012 with CHIA. And one of the questions that statement posed, one of the timely and important questions that it posed that were unanswered at the time was this: to what extent do these organization standards capture the significance of institutional decision-making and the faculty's role in that process? And I tried to answer that question through an article that eventually appeared in, I think it was the winter 2021 issue of Academe. And I analyzed the 7 accrediting agencies' standards around faculty governance. And what I found was not particularly encouraging, to put it politely. I'll just take them one at a time here quickly. The Accrediting Commission for Community and Junior Colleges, Western Association of Schools and Colleges, which has to be the longest name for any organization in the country, only has 4 standards, all of which address the faculty's curricular responsibilities, including one that grants the faculty something called, quote unquote, collective ownership over the design and improvement of the learning experience. Collective ownership sounds great, I guess, but I'm not quite sure what it means. If it said collective control, I guess I would think that it would be more consistent with AAUP standards, but for what it is, collective ownership. And by the way, the ACCJC's standards, its current standards were adopted in 2014. That's all it has is 4. The Higher Learning Commission, their new criteria, and depending on the organization, they call these standards, they call them criteria, There was a third term too that's slipping my mind at the moment, but the Higher Learning Commission's current criteria became effective in 2020. And they include just these three criteria regarding governance. The governing board expects the institution's faculty to oversee academic matters. That appears consistent with the AAUP's standard that the board delegate its authority to the faculty for academic matters. Shared governance engages its internal constituencies through planning, policies, and procedures. And the institution's administration ensures that faculty, and this is very interesting, and when appropriate, staff and students are involved in setting academic requirements, policy, and processes through effective collaborative structures. There's lots of big words in all of these accrediting agency standards, but they don't come close to AAUP recommendations. The AAUP, of course, as I said, according to our principles, it's the faculty that has primary decision-making authority in terms of setting academic requirements, policy, and processes. Our standards do not make room for staff and students to be meaningfully involved in that process. After all, presumably, staff and students don't have the collective expertise that faculty does. Middle states, which will be of particular interest to you all in New York, of course, just 3 of the nearly 50 total criteria that Middle States employs, just 3 of the 50 mention the faculty's role in institutional governance. And these are that an accredited institution is characterized by the following: student learning experiences that are designed, delivered, and assessed by faculty, full-time or part-time, and or other appropriate professionals. I don't know who that latter category refers to. If it refers to professional librarians and people like that, great. That's consistent with our standards. If it refers to others, probably not. An accredited institution is also characterized by organized and systematic assessments that are conducted by faculty and or those mysterious appropriate professionals again, and a clearly articulated and transparent governance structure that outlines the roles, responsibilities, and accountability for decision-making by the various constituencies. And these Middle States current standards were published in 2015. And that is all they have to say. And you'll notice so far, I mean, if you think back to the slide about that lists the faculty's areas of primary responsibility from the statement on government, there's nothing so far about methods of instruction, subject matter, research, matters of faculty status, nothing. NYSC standards are the strongest and the most numerous in terms of describing different aspects of the faculty's role in institutional governance. And so you can see, this standard, and these NYSC standards were adopted in 2016, that the institution places primary responsibility for the curriculum with the faculty. I mean, that's almost verbatim from the statement on government, right? That's good stuff. Faculty have a substantive voice. Well, the statement on government would say more than that, but that's still better than what we've seen so far. In educational programs, faculty personnel, and other areas that relate to the faculty's responsibility and expertise. In addition, faculty responsibilities include the following, and have these additional duties like advisement, academic planning, research, institutional governance. These are codified in NYSC standards, which is very unusual. So unusual, in fact, it's the only accrediting body that is this explicit about so many areas of faculty participation. And then as well, it goes on to talk about faculty searches and the faculty's role in assessment. And this is all pretty close to AAUP recommended standards. Northwest Commission, which adopted their standards in 2020, really not so much. These are among the weakest. This is all that's in there, that the institution recognizes the central role of the faculty to do X, Y, and Z. And really, it's all about curriculum and students, nothing about the other areas of primary responsibility. And then Northwest Commission's standards also insist that the institution's decision-making structures and processes include provisions for the consideration of the views of faculty. Consideration of the views of faculty. Okay. The Southern Association, their standards were, or they call them principles, I believe. These were adopted in 2017. And I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, but this is mostly about the faculty's role, the faculty not even really having a defined role in educational programs or in curriculum or in any of the things that we would expect the faculty to have a primary role in. It's just kind of a blanket statement about student learning being central to the mission of a college or university. And then the same thing here, pretty much an empty statement about what the institution does when it comes to governance. And this is pretty much the bare minimum: publishing policies, demonstrating that educational programs are, adequate. And then the last one finally comes close to AAUP standards, and that's placing primary responsibility for the curriculum with the faculty. Again, that could be taken, that is taken almost verbatim from the Statement on Government. And then finally, the Western Association, it revised the latest version of their standards can be found are from 2018. And the document includes a total of 4 standards, each of which is broken down into a number of criteria for review. Of the 39 total criteria used by the Western Association, only 1 addresses the role of the faculty in institutional governance. And it's here. The institution's faculty exercises leadership and ensures academic quality. And the institution clearly defines the roles, rights, and responsibilities in governance of both full-time and part-time faculty. That is all. What strikes somebody first after digging through the 7 accrediting agency standards is the complete lack of uniformity in terms of the standards length and structure. These documents range from like 10 pages to 35 pages. The number of standards ranges between 2, that's the Northwest, and 14. 4 of the 7 organizations include a separate standard on institutional governance. Only 1 has a separate standard on faculty. They don't even have uniformity in terms of the word governance and the use of it. The Western Association only uses the word governance once across its entire document. NYSC uses it 13 times. The word faculty appears in Middle States standards only 9 times. 9 instances of the word faculty across all of Middle State standards. 62 times in NYSC standards. One would reasonably expect more consistency, I would argue, among commissions that not only serve the same group, colleges and universities, but have ostensibly the same purpose, as Chia said, to ensure academic integrity. Another observation, generally speaking, is the inadequacy of the standards regarding the faculty's role in institutional governance, especially when we stack them up against what we find in the Statement on Government: curriculum, subject matter, methods of instruction, research, faculty status, faculty setting the requirements for degrees and admissions requirements. All the things that I talked about earlier, most of them are completely absent from these standards. When we also add in the faculty should have a meaningful role in budgetary decisions, facilities, strategic planning, also these standards are silent on the faculty's role in those areas. So aside from identifying the faculty as a mere constituency that somehow participates in assessment and oversees the curriculum and some other vaguely defined academic matters, the standards of 6 of the agencies say virtually nothing about any of those other areas of faculty primacy. And the only one that does, NYSC, still falls short, well short of the AAUP's recommended standards. Generally speaking, the standards of all 7 just assign way too many areas of faculty primacy, including things like research and matters of faculty status, generally to quote unquote the institution rather than specifically to the faculty. And we all know what the standards mean with the term institution. It means either administration or board. It does not mean faculty. Some other general observations and conclusions. 5 of the regional accreditors' standards on faculty governance have pretty much stayed the same since 2008 in terms of their inadequacy. And I use 2008 as a baseline because it was in that year that the AAUP published a compilation of relevant standards, similar to what I tried to do in my article, across the regional accrediting bodies. And so I was able to compare what I was looking at with what they had in 2008. And 5 of the accreditors are pretty much doing the same thing. 2, though, including middle states, have actually de-emphasized the role of the faculty in institutional decision-making. So middle states specifically, in that 2008 report, that 2008 report reproduced a lengthy paragraph directly from middle states' then standards that describes the commission's expectation of a climate of shared collegial governance. Issues are openly discussed. Each major constituency contributes to an appropriate degree. That language was all pretty consistent with the statement on government. It vanished at some point between 2008 and when I looked at the standards, a year or 2 ago. No such language exists anymore in middle state standards. Middle states, interestingly, also used to have a separate standard called faculty, and here it is. I mean, it looks pretty good, or I should say looked pretty good, because it too has vanished. Bear primary responsibility for student learning, devising, developing, monitoring, instructional, research, and service programs. Like I said, it looked pretty good. So did this. It was part of the same section on faculty. Primary responsibility, language right from the statement on government, for teaching, research, and scholarship, curriculum review, institutional planning, great stuff. Vanished. The current standards don't speak to any primary responsibilities of faculty. And Northwest too, they have really de-emphasized the role of the faculty. The conclusion of that 2008 report about Northwest said the accrediting handbook of Northwest includes some of the strongest affirmations of the faculty's role in shared governance. Something happened in the subsequent decade and a half. I can only conclude that Northwest current standards are both the smallest in number, and that was simply a matter of counting, and among the weakest, the very weakest of any of the accreditors. And that's, it's disheartening that none of the 7 has done anything since 2008 to improve their standards. It's even more disheartening that 2 of them saw fit to diminish the faculty's role in institutional decision-making. And so in terms of just some recommendations, accrediting agencies ostensibly are concerned with improving academic quality. So it seems to follow from that they should be working toward not only both strengthening their standards in terms of the faculty's role, but making them more uniform. The variation is just wild across the 7. And ideally, they should be aligning their standards on faculty governance with the normative principles that were set forth in the statement on government more than 50 years ago, more than 55 years ago now, since again, that statement was jointly formulated by the big 3 organizations that represent faculty, presidents, and trustees more generally. In terms of faculty action, And I thank you for bearing with me through this lengthy presentation, which I know I've gone through very quickly. Faculty action in the areas of governance and accreditation. This is from the introduction to the Red Book, the latest edition of the Red Book, which Joerg, of course, edited. Throughout the AAUP's history, one of the association's primary goals has been to encourage institutions to adopt our policy statements. And the central role of an AAUP chapter is to seek such an adoption, working ideally with the faculty senate or whatever your institutional governance bodies are. That's the overall goal, right? To get as much of this into as much of your handbook or CBA as possible. That's a chapter's primary function. More specifically, individual faculty members, individual AAUP members, AAUP chapters can promote governance standards in a bunch of different ways. Again, getting them into your faculty handbook as an appendix, verbatim, or bits and pieces throughout, whatever you can get. But, you know, the old school ways of publishing a newsletter, sponsoring meetings and forums like the one today, maintaining a website and making yourselves visible and vocal in as many different ways as you can. Joerg, of course, the instrument he put together on governance assessment is invaluable. Administer it on your campus. See what it shows you. Compare it to the national results he has and that are published on the AAUP website to see where you need to get to work in terms of improving governance. Regular communication, consistent with the statement on government, with the administration and governing board is crucial. For the faculty to communicate, especially with the governing board, without the president there, is particularly important. And that goes back to those best practices, the best practices statement. Advocating for the regular evaluation of administrators. I saw a question in the chat earlier about, you know, it's quite hypocritical. I think Anne had put this in the chat that it's pretty hypocritical for the administration not to submit to evaluations of itself when faculty are constantly being evaluated by students and administrators and their faculty peers. Supporting and cooperating with faculty governance bodies is another important role the chapter can play, and holding those bodies accountable when they need to be. When your Senate president sells out the faculty, the chapter can be there as an independent entity to call that person out. And then, of course, it's a matter of, as Joerg said, of organization, just getting people involved, getting them to not only join the AAUP, but to become active in the chapter and the chapter's activities, and by extension, to get involved in institutional decision-making. When it comes to faculty action regarding accreditation, one of the statement I mentioned earlier from 1968, the role of the faculty in the accrediting of colleges and universities, which is in the Red Book. It includes 6 recommended standards for institutions. And I reproduced them on these last slides here, mostly for your reference, not so I can read them to you. But these 6 recommendations make clear what the faculty's role should be in the accreditation process. The language is consistent with the statement. I have a primary responsibility for preparation of the academic aspects of the institution's self-evaluation should rest with the faculty and should be the responsibility of the faculty. And it shouldn't be, the draft shouldn't be altered without consultation with the faculty. It gets into this kind of detail. The self-evaluation should include a description of the following 3 areas, the second of which, of course, is the faculty's role in institutional government. The third and fourth recommendations are that the faculty should have access to a draft of the self-evaluation, which they can then make amendments to. Faculty should meet with the visiting team to discuss questions of faculty concern, including governance. The report of the visiting committee should be made available to the entire faculty. It shouldn't just disappear into the administration building's abyss. And then the faculty should be kept abreast of things that happen after the site visit. In the article statement, institutional accreditation, a call for greater faculty involvement. It includes further recommendations. Like I said, the AAUP has long recommended, urged that faculty participate in the self-study. We can't be critical of this process if we're not gonna participate in it. Use a faculty committee in the campus governance structure, and or use the AAUP chapter as an accreditation resource. Attend, regional accreditors hold annual meetings, or most of them do. I think they all do. Attend one. It may not be the most pleasant experience, but it helps to understand. And then, of course, we have a separate article that was co-written by my colleague at the AAUP, Greg Schultz, the faculty role in regional accreditation, service on evaluation teams. Its major recommendation is to serve on one of these visiting teams, which York has done, I think, several times. It addresses the how do you get onto one of these things, which York touched on earlier in response to a question, and the advantages and disadvantages of serving on these accreditation teams. The disadvantages, of course, are the time and effort they take, but the advantage is that you can help to shape the process. Given your knowledge of governance as faculty members, you can help to shape, how the institution improves its governance and the faculty's role in governance. And then finally, and again, with my apologies for such a lengthy presentation, my gratitude for your patience with it. These are links to 3 of the 5 statements and articles that I've mentioned. I don't have links to the other 2. What I do have, though, are PDFs that I will share with Sally when I send her this presentation. So you'll have access to all 5 of these in electronic form. And then, of course, if you ever have questions or need assistance regarding governance, accreditation, academic freedom, anything that's in the Red Book, please always feel free to send an email message to our department's generic address, academicfreedom@aaup.org. And I thank you again for your patience and attention.
Thank you, Michael. That was really, really helpful. I'm gonna call on myself first, and because I've got kind of a general question. Julie's kind of in the queue, and then I see hands up. So, I mean, I keep hearing from faculty who are in the middle of accreditation that, oh, we're really going to blow up our institution, and we're going to complain to the accrediting, body that's in here, and this will do it. This will get something done. And it seems to me this is the question. The reality is probably not, but we really do have to dig deeper in to all the ways you are suggesting we participate, as opposed to being one of the interviewees who says whatever to one of the visiting to one of the visiting accreditors.
Yeah, I completely agree, Hollis. I mean, it's important to when faculty do meet with the visiting team, it's important for faculty to make their views known and to point out where they see deficiencies in governance or academic freedom or what have you. But it's not going to be nearly as meaningful. I mean, the team will take that feedback, back to where they came from and write up their report and maybe include it, maybe not, depending on how often and how loudly they heard it. But what would be more meaningful, I agree with you, is to participate in the nitty-gritty of it in any or all of those ways that these last few slides outlined. That continues to be the AAUP's recommendation for faculty involvement in this, and that's the rub, right? I mean, it's great to say be as involved as you can, but you all know as well as I do, we've got enough to do as it is as faculty members. Do any of us really have the time and energy to volunteer for an evaluating committee in the hope of getting on it and then spending a few days at some unknown campus, going through their governance documents, interviewing people? I mean, it's a rigorous process, and we all feel like we don't have enough time already just trying to do what we're supposed to do in terms of teaching, research, and service. To pile this on, it's a lot, and it can easily be too much. but there is no better way to not only to make the process better, but to improve conditions for faculty governance in terms of accreditation than to be involved.
Right, right. Thank you. I think Julie's got a pretty straightforward question, then we'll go to Leah. So Julie?
Thank you, Hollis. I had put 2 questions in the chat. Do you know which one you wanted me to ask? Okay. Let's see. I guess I'll go ahead and ask my first question because it occurred to me when Michael, you were going over the role of a chapter on campus. I'm the president of the AAUP chapter at the New School, and we're a fledgling chapter. We're moving into our 2nd year, and our administration mostly refuses to speak to us. And they have said that anything that we want to bring up needs to go through the UFS. And then in instances when we've tried to go through the Senate in order to raise the issue, they've also blocked it that way. And I'm wondering, is there any meaningful standard for speaking to an AAUP chapter, communicating with them?
We don't have policy standards on that specifically, Julie. It's a really good question, though. And what I would say is, I'd go back first to one of the general principles from the Statement on Government, the one about adequate communication. That should include an AAUP chapter, especially since the administration should recognize that an AAUP chapter can serve a very different function from, say, a university faculty senate. Chapter members have potentially an expertise in, these policies and standards that maybe a senate doesn't have. As an independent entity, a chapter can play an important role. And under no circumstances should it simply be disregarded by the administration under the guise of somehow not being allowed to meet. That's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned, to just
inject. I thought so.
Yeah, I mean, I can't meet with the AAUP, presumably because that would somehow bypass the faculty senate, because we hear this all the time. One potential solution is to make sure there's as much overlap as possible between the AAUP chapter and the Senate in terms of its leadership, especially. So one of the things we've been fortunate to have been able to do at Merrimack over the last decade or so is to have lots of overlap between our Senate officers. Most of our Senate officers have been members of the chapter. And a lot of our Senate presidents have also been past presidents of our chapter. So when you can just kind of meld those two, it not only improves, the working relationship between the two bodies, it can also demonstrate to the administration that, you're not just dealing with the Senate over there and maybe the chapter over there, but they're going to be ignored if we can. They're together now. And that's twice as strong. And now you kind of have to deal with it.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Leah?
Yes, thank you. I have 2 questions. I go with my first. I was wondering, does the AAUP joint statement on shared governance get sort of renewed by the College Presidents and Boards Association along with AAUP? And if it does, when was the last time? And if it doesn't, then it's problematic, because I think at least the current presidents in the past decade that I've been talking to really are unfamiliar with the standards. They don't believe in the standards. They don't think they're relevant to what we're supposed to be doing on our campus. And if the last date they were renewed by these larger bodies was 55 years ago, that becomes a problem.
Yeah, it's a good question, Leah. No, the statement has not been renewed in any way or even revised in any way since its original publication. What happened instead, as I mentioned earlier, I believe it was 2018, the AGB's board of directors issued a white paper on academic governance. And in that white paper, they reaffirmed, much to the pleasure of the Committee on College and University Governance. In fact, we issued our own statement, applauding the AGB Board of Governors for doing this. the board reaffirmed its commitment to the principles in that statement and reaffirmed the importance of having that statement, or at least the principles articulated in it, as part of the institution's formal governing documents. That was an unexpected and quite welcome reaffirmation from the AGB's Board of Governors. I do not know where the ACE stands on the statement anymore, but it may very well be worth, if not revising it, maybe recirculating it to those other two organizations as a not so subtle reminder of what they should be, the kinds of principles they should be encouraging among their membership.
Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
Kimberly? Thanks, Kimberly.
Yeah, so our sad story at Nassau Community College is that the chair of our last accrediting visit by Middle States had been sanctioned by AAUP the year before for governance. So I saw her name and was appalled. So I wrote an email to the faculty alerting them to this point. Of course, the administration was furious that I did so. I called Middle States and expressed my concern. Of course, nothing happened except she really nailed us on faculty and shared governance, et cetera. It was just so disturbing, of course. And I wonder what we as an organization, National AAUP, can do about something like this. I mean, those sanctions are incredibly important, and I'm not suggesting that they're not important for us to do as an organization, but this was just, it's just so disappointing to us as AAUP members. And I was reflecting about this as you were talking, Michael, and I remember there used to be an AAUP, a college and university accreditation committee. And I looked back while you were speaking, and there is no longer. And I'm just wondering if maybe you can bring back to the staffers about now might be the time to reinvigorate that committee. Because clearly in New York State, this conference was developed to address the issues with accreditation. And I know colleagues around the nation, I mean, your presentation today explaining the standards with the different regional organizations. So I'm just wondering if perhaps we should re-entertain that idea.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Kimberly. I don't know. Do you know how long ago that committee existed, or as recently as it existed? Do you have any sense?
I know that, maybe 5+ years ago, I wrote a letter with the chair of that committee about an accreditation issue of a community college in California, but I wasn't able to find it. I noticed that it's no longer in the committee structure, and I think maybe if we go back 5 years or so, it was. I don't recall any conversations at national meetings about this committee, so.
I don't either. That's part of the reason I asked, and that's why I'm glad you brought it up. I will definitely inquire with my colleagues, especially ones who have been on the staff much longer than I have, about not only the fate of that committee, but about its reintroduction, which, if I recall correctly, and others of you who have been on the council or are on the council, I'm thinking of Anne and Sally and others, I think a committee can only be established by the council, but I'm not quite sure about that.
My understanding, Michael, is that the president of the AAUP appoints committee members.
Yes.
That's always the way it was when we were there.
Yep, that's exactly right, Sally. I think the establishment of a committee, though, has to be by action of council, right? Yeah.
Thank you. We've got 10 minutes. We've got 3 questions I see, and if we have time, we're going to get to Julie's second question. So just to kind of gauge timing here. So Erwin.
Yes, I believe it or not, I actually was on that committee on accreditation. Committee D it was. If you remember, staff of AAUP, Ernst Benjamin
Mhm.
was the staff person who staffed that committee. Now, Ernst is gone from AAUP staff a long time. So that committee is gone at least 5 years. It's probably more like 10. But when I was on the committee, I would say the conclusion was that accrediting bodies did not really support faculty's role in the government of the statement and government.
Mhm.
Even in those days, it was a very, very ineffective way of protecting the faculty's role. And I think what you've indicated, Michael, is that is continued that way. And that if we depend on accrediting bodies, we're not going to go very far. I would like to stress the point you made, which is that really the support of faculty has to come on the campus, not from accrediting bodies. I could talk about my experience at City College and one of our accreditation visits, where we did everything you said we should do. And when they met with the visiting committee and so on, and of course, when their report came in, it had not one word about what the faculty had proposed and the issues that we had raised. So once even if you engage in the process, there's no way of controlling the outcome. So that really, to me, the important part of your talk was the last part, where you talk about what faculty can do on campus. And I would endorse all of those things. They don't always work, but it's really the only way that the faculty can influence what's happening and try to make the government standards real instead of just paper.
Yeah, thanks, Erwin. For what it's worth, I completely agree. And like I said, those are still the AAUP's, recommendations, best recommendations regarding the faculty's role in the accreditation process. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at those and to get involved to the extent that you feel like you can.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Erwin, we can always count on you.
Yeah, what Erwin said about Committee D and Ernie Benjamin staffing it and Erwin being a member of it is really helpful too. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you. Mary Rose.
Thanks, Hollis. And yes, thanks, Erwin, for that insight. And sorry, maybe going sort of in the opposite direction of Erwin, because I'm intrigued, and thank you so much for your presentation, Michael, and that article and the research you've done on this. I'm kind of, this is purely out of ignorance, how are these regional accrediting bodies structured? Like, what is their governance structure? And because I'm thinking, if we want them to get them to change their, standards or whatever they're called, right? I mean, who do we need to influence, right? And I'm wondering if you have any insight for us on that.
Mary Rose, that's a really good question. And I don't think I have, I don't know how each of the 7 is organized in terms of their own governance structures. I'm sure, each of them obviously has a website, and you can find their standards, and I'm sure you can find their, the composition of their governing boards and their organizational structure too. To answer that question, I just don't know what they look like off the top of my head. To your second related question, I guess who faculty would try and influence or appeal to in terms of these accrediting agencies generally would be CHIA, the Council on Higher Education Accreditation. They're, as far as I recall, they're based in DC. They are the national organization, the umbrella for these regional accreditors. I think, as Erwin suggested and others have too, and Kimberly talking about her experience writing to middle states and not really getting anywhere. And we see this in the national office too, with complaints that we get. The regional accrediting agencies are just, in a word, unresponsive to faculty petitions, especially a single faculty member. As somebody mentioned earlier, maybe it was Hollis, I apologize, I can't remember, but kind of complaining to a regional accrediting agency is not it's the impulse that many of us have when we feel like we're not getting anywhere on our campus. But 999 times out of 1,000, it's not going to get us anywhere either to appeal directly to the regional agency. If you can get a group of faculty to do it on behalf of a senate, a chapter, maybe you'll have a bit more success. I know we just went through this. You've probably heard about a merger of two Philadelphia institutions, St. Joseph's University and the University of the Sciences. St. Joe's has basically acquired U Sciences, and U Sciences faculty had no other option, they felt, but to file a complaint with the accrediting agency. The accrediting agency did not care one bit about it, which is really disheartening, of course. But it was just kind of a small group of faculty with really no weight of the Senate behind it. They have no chapter there. And so there's no incentive for an accrediting body to do anything about that, which is just unfortunate and really disheartening.
I'm like, I agree, but I mean, that's why I think it's really important to get them to change those standards, because once those standards are changed on paper, then they can be like, then they can be like, then we can use them at the local level or at the state level. So I mean, I think that's probably like, if we're going to sort of be dealing with middle states or CHIA at all, I think what we need to be asking for is strengthening of those standards rather than appealing individual cases, which, as you say, is relatively useless.
No, I completely
so
agree.
thanks.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you, Michael, for an excellent presentation. I had a quick question. I'd like to get your thoughts about reconciling different points of views about shared governance on campuses. Some administrators on my campus think that shared governance is purely just an enterprise on the campus between faculty, administrative staff, and the like, and the board are outside of that shared governance, different type of governance. And I want to get your perspective on that thought and how to reconcile different views of shared governance so we can come together. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That's another good question. I guess I would say first, obviously the board does have a significant role to play in the government of the institution under the statement on government and just kind of according to common sense. I mean, what does the board do if not involve itself appropriately in the government of the institution? That's kind of its job. More importantly, in terms of reconciling different views of governance, I consider myself a conciliatory person, but when it comes to governance, I am not. I'm pretty stubborn about insisting upon the standards in here. So when my provost tells me, well, that's not shared governance is X, Y, and Z instead, I say, no, you're wrong. So let me just read to you from here. Or when the president says, no, shared governance is A, B, and C, I say, no, you're wrong. And I read what's in here. And that's really all you can. I've found that it may not always be effective, but, you know, one of the important functions a chapter can play, a senate can play, and I don't think I had this on those slides, is to educate the board, the administration about AAUP principles. That's a major function. And so part of that education is to point out as loudly as needed when they're simply wrong in their personal conception of shared governance. I don't mean this to sound as maybe crass as it might. I actually don't care what my president's personal definition of shared governance is. I don't care what my provost's personal definition is, or the assistant dean, or even my colleagues. I care about what's in here, and I just keep repeating it as often as necessary in the hope that eventually at some point it will, through osmosis or just annoyance, it will sink in and people will start to repeat it and then actually act according to it. I feel like that's an unsatisfactory answer to your question, but that's what I found to be the most effective.
Thank you. We're out of time. Julie, can you ask that last question kind of? I think it's straightforward about determining hiring lines.
Mhm.
About which program.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Michael, I just want to reiterate that your presentation was so awesome. Yeah, so sorry, I'm from California. So my my question was, you know, in the faculty determination of academic matters, where does hiring lines fall into that, especially as programs are getting starved and others are well fed?
Yeah, great question. Faculty have primary responsibility, or should, for matters of faculty status: appointments, reappointments, dismissal, tenure, promotion. It follows from that faculty should also have primary responsibility for determining where faculty lines are needed, where new faculty appointments are needed. We've all gotten very used to the administration refusing our requests for faculty lines, or just ignoring them altogether, or simply handpicking those departments that are going to get a line next year because I said so and I'm the provost and that's the end of the story. That is not consistent with AAUP standards. It should be in the faculty's hands to determine which departments get lines and how many, and any related matters, because that is, excuse me, a matter of faculty status.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Michael. We are out of time, and I think I've been seeing comments in the chat, and we all really appreciate this. This is very, very helpful.
Thank you. I'm glad. And if there are other questions, please feel free to email me personally. I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Great. So Sally, my job is done. It's up to you.
Thank you, Hollis, and thank you, Sally. And take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you so much. And please extend our thanks to Joerg as well, although we did already, just once again for your time and your expertise. Very much appreciated.
I will do that. I hope to see some of you at the biennial meeting in June in person. Take care, everybody.
Long time coming. Great.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So for the rest of viewers who are still here, we're not quite done before we break for lunch. We'd appreciate your attention to what we think is a very important matter that has been brewing here at the state conference level. We took the initiative last year in instituting some statewide conference awards, New York State AAUP Conference Awards, to honor members, chapters, state conference leadership, others who have contributed to the well-being of our members, chapters, and the conference as a whole. Last year, we gave out 2 awards. One was an award for service to AAUP members in New York State, and that was awarded to Erwin Yelowitz, who is sitting with us here today. Another award was the award for service to the New York State Conference, and that was awarded to Pat Sheehan, who is also, do I see Pat? I don't see Pat here at the moment. He was at our meeting yesterday. And this year, the awards committee determined that we would do yet a 3rd award. And this award is for service to AAUP collective bargaining chapters in New York State. And this award will be in honor of Francis Frank Higman, who recently passed away in December. Those of you who knew Frank, he was an amazing man. And so we have decided this year that we are announcing that the award that was given to Pat Sheehan last year will be the Pat Sheehan Award for service to the New York State Conference, that the award we gave to Erwin Yelowitz last year will be known from here on as the Erwin Yelowitz Award for service to AAUP members in New York State. And beginning this time forward, we will also have the Francis Frank Higman Award for service to AAUP collective bargaining chapters in New York State. We did not get any applications for any of these awards this year. However, we will be starting the application search process again in the fall. And we would encourage you to start thinking now about people that you know that may be good recipients for being considered for one of these awards. And we encourage you to submit an application once that call goes out in the fall. So I want to thank the members of the awards committee for working with us. The awards, I think I can say for Erwin and Pat last year were beautiful awards. And I know that they were both well received and enjoyed. I heard back from them. So we're very honored to be able to have these awards, and most importantly, to have these individuals that we can name them for as part of our state conference. So thank you. Unless there's any other comments about these awards, we will, as I said, break for lunch. You're welcome to stay here and eat lunch together. If not, we will reconvene at 12:30 for our next round of speakers. But I would encourage, if you have anything to say to any of our awards recipients and about them, to please make those comments now.
Congratulations.
Well deserved on all accounts, I can assure you. Ann? You're muted, Ann.
Pat is not here. He's been an invaluable leader in the state conference as our treasurer, very humble man. In terms of Erwin, has he disappeared?
Oh, he's here.
I can't say.
Still here, Ann.
I mean, Erwin, Erwin is totally deserving of this award and many others. His service to AAUP is very long and highly important, as you heard when he reminded us earlier, going back, way back to Ernie Benjamin, who I remember was kind of an infant in AAUP at the time, but I do remember that. And of course, his work in the PSC, its committees, its retiree chapter has been really profound. And I know Erwin is always a go-to person, and I feel a really good personal friend of mine, and I think we're super lucky to have him.
Thank you, Ann.
My pleasure.
Anyone else have anything to say? If not, as I said, we're going to break for lunch. Feel free to stick around and eat lunch with others if you'd like, or just get outside, walk around and take a break.
12:30, thank you.
You're very welcome. We reconvene at 12:30. Hey, Kimberly. You're muted.
Yeah. Hi, Sally.
Hey.
I'm looking at the schedule for the afternoon speakers, and I know we had spoken by email that you'll be doing what you did last year in terms of keeping track of questions on the chat and
You want me to do the questions? Okay.
Yeah, but I just want to make sure that I understand the format, because it's a little bit different than other sessions. And that involves, so each speaker will speak about 15 minutes or so. Then we have 5 minutes between the three different, I should say each institution will speak for 15 minutes. Then the panel discussion from 120 to 150 it was the thought that the panelists would be interacting with one another, because I see after that the Q&A follows.
Right. The idea for the panel discussion was they were going to continue with more specified like information, and then there could be some individual questions about that. They were each going to be given a few more minutes The 120 to what, excuse me, the
120 to 150.
It's 30 minutes that it was broken down that they were going to share that time to talk amongst each other and have it leads into the Q&A. It leads into the Q&A. It's just a little bit more like each one of them is going to give their piece. And then they can sit down and do it interactively and then the question and answers. But there will be also Q&A during that period of time as well. If they
Oh, so we will have Q&A during that time as well. Okay.
They're accepting of that, yes.
Okay. All right. So we won't have Q&A when they're giving their first spiel first. No. Okay.
No,
okay,
that's what the panel part is for.
Okay. I just wanted to confirm that. Thanks, Sally.
Right. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, Kimberly.
Yeah.
I'll see you in a little bit.